Perhaps one disclaimer, I'm by no means an Eleanor specialist, but I'm a British social historian. I'm interested in voluntary social work. So I've encountered Eleanor in many guises, and I'm currently just working on something that will become evident as I go through. So this is, in a sense, a bit of work in progress that I'm trying out on you, and would be very grateful for your feedback. When Eleanor Rathbone graduated from Oxford University in 1896, she and some of her friends reflected on their experience and noted that they'd been encouraged by their tutors and by fellow students over the last 3 years to be ambitious, to believe that they'd got abilities that were worth developing, and that they had skills to offer. They also reflected that the reality that they faced was unpromising, because there was very little for them to be ambitious about. There was very little scope for those abilities. Nobody really wanted their offerings. Most professions rejected women, and although things were changing in the field of women's employment, the sort of public life which attracted Eleanor and her women friends was closed to them. They couldn't stand for Parliament. They couldn't even vote. But Eleanor was more fortunate than she knew. Not only did she belong to a family with a highly developed sense of public service and the means to indulge it, but opportunities for women were increasing rapidly. And it seems to me that her youthful self would hardly have recognised the achievements of the woman who died in 1946. Because during the intervening half-century, she'd engaged in various forms of what could loosely be called public service. And I'll just list a few of them. In 1911, she conducted important investigations into the lifestyles of dockers and their families. She had been an active suffragist, although she rejected the methods adopted by the Pankhursts and their followers. She'd been responsible for allocating settlement allowances to women whose husbands were in the forces between 1914 and 1918. She had pursued a 20-year campaign for what she called family endowment and we could now call child benefit, which was finally realised after her death. She had fought what she believed to be feminist causes in India. She'd been an active city councillor in Liverpool for 26 years until 1935, and an MP for the combined English universities for 16 years, from 1929 until her death. And through most of that time, she had been an irritant to whichever government was in power by pursuing what she saw as important humanitarian causes. All that was a very far cry from the traditional do-gooding work of rent collecting or acting as a friendly visitor for the Charity Organisation Society that she had feared and that had characterised the activities of many women of her class and outlook at the beginning of the 20th century. Today, if it's discussed at all, and regrettably it isn't discussed much, Eleanor's main legacy is believed to be what she called family endowment, became known as family allowances, and now known as child benefit. And it's important not to downgrade that. It is a fantastic legacy. It's a legacy that's transformed the lives of hundreds and thousands of people. And as she insisted all the way through her campaign that the money should be paid to the mother, it has given many thousands of women control over an important aspect of family finance. But today I want to think about another aspect of her work, much less often discussed, with some of the victims of Hitler's actions in Europe. And I want to use it as a sort of handle, as a sort of way of getting into understanding her underlying motives. Try to discover a little bit more about Eleanor and what drove her to respond to what she perceived to be the needs around her. It's July 1940. A letter arrives on Eleanor Rathbone's desk in London from a man imprisoned in a camp and outlining the treatment that he and other men were suffering. Many of them were elderly. Many, but not all, were Jewish. And they were deeply concerned and frightened. And I just want to lift, it's a very long letter, and I want to lift out just a few extracts. This man says that about 4,000 men have been herded into accommodation designed for about 350, and these were men who'd been taken from their families in the middle of the night or the early hours of the morning. There are very few beds, and some of those that there are have been taken by medically trained inmates to equip a sort of makeshift hospital for their sick colleagues. And these beds are pretty much all they have, these doctors, because they're not allowed medical instruments and they're not allowed medicines. There's almost no other furniture. Few tables, a handful of chairs. Not enough buildings for the 4,000 men, so those who can't get into them to get shelter are having to sleep under canvas. And they're having to make their own mattresses by stuffing straw into sacks. This is a not untypical North European summer, so there's been lots of rain, which means that these men are in very muddy conditions. There's no fuel, so no hot water, no luxury like soap, so the inmates are dirty with all the public health risks that attach to that, and the rations are inadequate. There is, of course, no contact with the outside world, no radio, no newspapers. So the inmates have no idea about the safety or otherwise of their families, and little about the progress of the war. All that they have is rumour fueled by fear. They are allowed mail, but of course all letters are censored. So this is a process that takes time. So actually, in practical terms, very little mail is delivered to the inmates and very little gets out. From time to time, large numbers of men, sometimes more than 500 at a time, are taken from the camp and transported to an unknown destination. For some of the inmates, this isn't the first camp they've experienced. So even as early as 1940, these sudden removals fill them with terror. Some men have committed suicide rather than continue to exist in this precarious situation. And I could go on, but this is a picture from the Second World War we all recognise, isn't it? This is all very familiar. But this isn't Poland or Germany. This camp's about 6 miles from where we're sitting now, in Huyton. And according to one recent account, the conditions here were better than at some other British camps. So what was all this? Who were these men? Why were they there? What were these camps? And why did Eleanor get involved? Under pressure from the military leadership and the Secret Service, assisted by campaigns in newspapers like the Daily Sketch and the Daily Express, which published almost daily articles illustrated with unsubstantiated stories about refugees acting as fifth columnists. One of Churchill's first actions on becoming Prime Minister in 1940 was to say, collar the lot. And by the lot, he meant all European aliens. And that included recently arrived refugees, escapees from Germany and Austria, as well as people who had been living in this country for many years. And the effect of his instruction was that the system of grading those who'd been labelled enemy aliens, which John Anderson, the then Home Secretary, had designed in 1939, was just suddenly abandoned. Because Anderson knew that many of the more than 70,000 aliens of German, Italian and Austrian extraction in Britain were Jewish refugees from Germany, or long-term residents, often with British spouses. And Anderson's system, which depended on a network of tribunals and considered individual cases, had been designed to allow them freedom to known Nazi Germans, many of whom had worked here for decades, while incarcerating those who perhaps held some danger to Britain or were suspected of being Nazi sympathisers. Under Churchill's new system, even those who had recently escaped from Germany were arrested, often in dawn raids, and internment camps were hurriedly set up to receive them. The camp at Huyton was on a half-built housing estate, the Woolfall estate, which, if you're going out of Liverpool on the East Lancs Road, is now a big council estate on the right-hand side, which they wrapped in barbed wire and was guarded by soldiers. And the effect of that on those who had experienced German concentration camps can only be imagined. But to return for a minute to the letter that Eleanor received from the Huyton camp. It had been sent by a man called Professor Wiesenberg, an academic chemist, who was the camp father elected by the inmates to represent them. And it was addressed to the Parliamentary Refugee Committee. Now, it's important to note that in spite of its title, this was not an official parliamentary committee. It was Eleanor's own creation, and at its beginning included 3 other MPs, and was backed by as many supporters in the House of Commons as she could attract. At its height, there were about 200 MPs associated with it, but it had very small beginnings. It was almost entirely financed by Eleanor, and it operated from her secretary's 2-room flat in central London, where Vera Craig, that secretary, did all the administrative and secretarial work associated with Eleanor's campaign for internees. The timing of Wiesenberg's communication was critical. It was sent on the 7th of July 1940. On the 2nd of July, just 5 days earlier, the merchant ship, the Arandora Star, carrying more than 1,200 internees from the UK to camps in Canada, had been torpedoed. It sank, and more than 800 lives were lost, about 630 of those being civilian internees. On the 6th of July, the day before the letter, an elderly German academic, a refugee from Germany, had committed suicide in the Huyton camp, and that was the second such suicide in a matter of days. At this point, it's important to note, I think, that although the conditions were very bad, the camp commandant received nothing but praise from visitors to the camp. He was the second commandant to have been appointed within a few weeks. The first seemed to have been a disaster. And he was clearly a compassionate man, but working in an impossible situation. But I think a mark of that compassion must be that, given the restrictions imposed on internees and their links with the outside world, he must have permitted the inmates to write to Eleanor's committee. And I suspect he must have facilitated the letter's delivery. I don't see how else it could have happened. But why Eleanor? Why did the letter go to her and to her committee? Well, that's a simple question to answer. She had form. And Wiesenberg, who'd been working in the University of Southampton since about 1934, I think, as an academic chemist, must have been aware of some of her work for Jewish people in the 1930s. Because her work for refugees went back to the early 1930s. She had been an active member of the League of Nations Union. She'd been active in humanitarian activities around the fallout of the early stages of the Spanish Civil War. She and her friend, the Conservative MP, the Duchess of Atholl, went to Madrid to investigate the treatment of refugees in 1936. From her position as chair of the British Committee for Refugees from Spain, she helped to remove about 4,000 children from Bilbao to the temporary safety of Britain in 1937. And she and her committee had to commit themselves to supporting those children while they were resident in Britain. She had tried to put pressure on the Red Cross to do more to help refugees in Spain, and was very critical of the organisation when she thought it wasn't moving quite quickly enough. What's the point of it, she asked, when it's not there when it's needed? And as the 30s moved on to more horror, she turned her attention to Czechoslovakia and to the plight of refugees there in the face of German threats. She used her position as MP for the combined English universities to write to her constituents, to inform them what was going on, and to urge their support for humanitarian activities. She visited the universities and held all sorts of meetings to alert staff and students to the plight of those trapped in Europe. She didn't hesitate to share her trenchant opinion of British diplomats who she thought were pussyfooting around the problem. In 1939, she complained that she believed the British chargé d'affaires in Prague to be anti-Czech. In Bucharest, she found members of the embassy there, to be anti-Semitic, and noticed that in some British consular circles there were men married to women whom she described as of a pro-Nazi kind. British diplomats don't come out very well, in her view, in the 1930s. And all the while, she used her seat in the House of Commons to ask questions and tried to inform her colleagues about the suffering that she believed she saw and that she feared would increase. She was no shrinking violet, and anybody who's seen her portrait of the ground floor of the Eleanor Rathbone building can see what a formidable opponent she might have been. But for a while in 1940, she found herself in a very difficult position. And there were a few weeks of almost silence on her part about the policy of internment. Because she'd been a critic of Chamberlain and an outspoken opponent of appeasement since 1933, on the grounds that Hitler's racial views and treatment of minorities made it a crime to accede to his request for rearmament or his demands for rearmament. She was convinced that the Nazi regime was not only internally autocratic, but she believed she could perceive the potent international threat that it held. So she'd been one of those very actively involved in the campaign to bring Chamberlain down, been delighted when Churchill became Prime Minister. And for a few weeks in the early stages of his Prime Ministership, had been very reluctant to make any sort of statement that could have been seen as critical. Even though right from the beginning she believed that the scale of internment that Churchill wanted was morally wrong and politically short-sighted. But Wiesenberg's letter changed all that, and she found herself in a strong position to speak out. Unlike her colleagues representing other university constituencies until about 1937, Eleanor gave her loyalty to no particular party, to no political party. And that gave her the freedom to pursue causes without bothering about party pressures, and it was a freedom she used to the full. Of course, the downside of that is that it also sometimes weakened her approach, because she could never rely on the support of other MPs of the same party. But she was nothing if not a confident woman, with her confidence of a very privileged upbringing, but also a confidence born, I think, of the rightness of the causes that she thought she was pursuing. And she could rely on some other colleagues, both inside and outside Parliament, including people like Victor Gollancz, the sort of maverick publisher, and members of the aristocracy like the Duchess of Atholl, who was Conservative MP for Perthshire and for a short while had been a junior minister in Baldwin's government. And there were others too, people like the Conservative MP Victor Cazalet, whose views on appeasement she didn't agree with at all, but who supported her on internment, and the Labour MP Graham White. And they used their influence to try to rally support for her causes. She also used her pen, as well as countless letters and articles. She wrote a satirical piece currently in her archive. Her archive is here in the Sidney Jones Library, entitled "How British Policy Towards Refugees Helps Hitler." And she criticised the folly of the policy of indiscriminate internment and argued that it was a very efficient way to make enemies among the internees and do indirectly to help the enemy. For example, she said, you could help Hitler by taking Germans from areas where they're known to areas where they're unknown, and then leave them to fend for themselves within a social context where the public has been warned not to trust Germans. And this she was referring to an earlier government policy of not allowing Germans to live in coastal areas. Or you could help Hitler by impeding the country's ability to fight the Nazis, by interning people with business or other skills that could actually be used to help the Allied cause. Or you could help him by interning increasing numbers of people, including those who'd been shown to offer no threat to security, and then couch the documents concerned in language that actually the police don't really understand, so that all sorts of people are interned who shouldn't be. And you could certainly help Hitler by putting internment camps in coastal areas, easily reached by invading armies who then have ready access to their Jewish inhabitants. And you could help him by delaying the separation of Nazi from non-Nazi internees, so that fear and confusion reigns in the camps. And the document goes on more in that vein. What she was doing was pinpointing the unthought through nature of this policy of indiscriminate internment. if you were an internee in a British camp, you'd certainly want Eleanor on your side. And in spite of her short-lived diffidence about challenging Churchill's judgment, the reality of internment had the effect of accelerating the work that Eleanor and her supporters had started earlier in 1940, because she and others, right from the start of the policy, had been asking questions in the House about conditions in the internment camp and pressing for the release of those internees who had, she believed, been unjustly imprisoned there. So she'd done practical things like asking for timetables for their release. She'd convened meetings of her unofficial parliamentary committee with the major refugee organisations. And once she'd decided to speak out again, she began to buttonhole ministers. This was a favourite tactic of hers, which led, so it's said, to ministers hiding behind pillars or darting into doorways in the Palace of Westminster if they saw her formidable figure with her bulging briefcase approaching them in a parliamentary corridor. They had less protection against her telephone attacks. She didn't hesitate to phone ministers at home if she thought it necessary. She also responded to Wiesenberg's plea that she visit the Huyton camp. I think this provides another indication of the basic humanity of the camp commandant doing his best under difficult circumstances, because he enabled a long discussion to take place between Eleanor and her supporters and a small group of internees actually on the camp. And in discussion with them, she discovered what she'd already suspected, that many had been refugees from Austria and others from Germany. Some had been doing valuable work for the Allied cause, just happened to be unfortunate enough to have a German name. All had been taken abruptly from their families, abruptly and indiscriminately. And at the end of the meeting, the MPs left the hut that they'd been given for the meeting to find it surrounded by a crowd of absolutely silent, anxious, unhappy men. It was pouring with rain. This was, after all, Liverpool in the summer. And Mary Stocks, Eleanor's first biographer, has painted a picture of Eleanor and a couple of supportive MPs standing on the steps of a hut in the camp under an umbrella. Eleanor spoke first, she says, with such moving sympathy of her concern for the state in which they were living and her anxiety to do anything possible to improve the situation. But the words that appear to have stuck in the internees' minds were just simply, "You are not forgotten." She was also a patriotic realist and asked that they shouldn't forget the British plight. Britain fearful of imminent invasion, France had fallen. Things did look very difficult. And it appears that her speech had a profound effect. Graham White, who was the Labour MP for Birkenhead East and one of her companions on that visit, said that the speech was one of the most remarkable he had ever heard, made without any sort of preparation. I can't believe that she didn't go totally unprepared, but clearly she didn't have notes. And this picture of the impression that she made is reinforced by a letter to the Times by somebody who'd been an internee in Huyton, who wrote to the Times after her death describing this encounter. And the words that he quotes are those that Mary Stocks also said made such a good impression. "You are not forgotten." As well as comforting to some extent those who were incarcerated, the visit gave rise to prolonged agitation in Parliament, as of course it was intended to. 2 new bodies were set up, an advisory committee under Mr. Justice Asquith to assist the Home Secretary in dealing with enemy aliens. And losing no time at all, Eleanor's own committee immediately dispatched a memo to them suggesting categories for earlier release. And also an advisory committee at the Foreign Office attached to the Refugee Department there. And both Graham White and Eleanor managed to get themselves co-opted onto that committee. The terms of reference of which included framing suggestions for the welfare of internees and the provision of adequate employment for them outside. On the 26th of August, so it's probably about 6 weeks after her visit, the Home Office issued a document indicating 19 categories of enemy aliens who were suitable for release. And a number of tribunals were set up for the purposes of combing through their dossier and trying to work out who could safely be released. And from that point, the emptying of the internment camps began to take place. And so did the improvement of conditions for those who were in them. This was a huge amount of work for Eleanor because she followed up individual cases, she attended committees, she drafted memos, she framed parliamentary questions, she wrote letters to the press, she haunted, and I use the verb advisedly, she haunted government departments, she visited prisons and internment camps. And true to her feminism, the welfare of women was always at the forefront of her concern. And she went to the Isle of Man, where there was another large internment camp. And there she made contact with interned women. She drew attention to the able, highly qualified, devoted women who were languishing at public expense in the Isle of Man camps, and argued that such waste was intolerable. They could have been so useful to the Allied cause. And attempts to remedy this cost her many letters and interviews. Osbert Peake, who was a junior minister at the Home Office, impugned by Susan Peterson as being a pretty useless individual, bore the brunt of her agitation. Eleanor certainly didn't rate him. She thought he was under Herbert Morrison's thumb. Herbert Morrison was his boss. And stupid, she said. But neither Osbert Peake nor Herbert Morrison rated her either. But she cared little for that, and her agitation made a huge impression. It's important, I think, to put Eleanor's work for internees into a slightly wider context. She wasn't alone in trying to ameliorate the conditions in the camps. For example, Rabbi Solomon Schonfeld, who was son-in-law to the then chief rabbi, had spent a day at the camp at almost exactly the same time as Eleanor, on the 18th of July. And he was chair of the chief rabbi's religious emergency committee, issued a report on that the following week. He was able to say, the commandant was trying to ameliorate things. He did try to draw the internees into the management camps. He was trying to arrange kosher food, and he was trying to arrange the release of sick internees. George Bell, the Bishop of Chichester, who was going to make himself very unpopular in government circles later in the war, when he used his seat in the House of Lords to criticise the policy of carpet bombing of German cities, also tried to work for the welfare of internees, as did Frederick Dwelly. Dwelly was Dean of Liverpool Cathedral, which had only been consecrated in the early 1930s. He visited the camp at Huyton. He struck up friendships with some of the internees, which lasted long after the war. There's a lot of correspondence in the cathedral archive from internees to Dwelly. But none had as much clout, I think, as Eleanor. And actually, in parentheses, it's interesting to note that I found no mention of Dean Dwelly's work in Eleanor's archive, and no mention of Eleanor's in Dean Dwelly's archive, and no mention of George Bell or the chief rabbi and his son-in-law in either. I think that clearly all sorts of things were going on that it's been difficult for me anyway to put it all together. So if any of you know any other information, I'd be very grateful. But more interestingly, in neither archive is there any mention of the local Jewish community, which was much bigger then than it is now. One assumes they must have been involved or trying to do something. But current members of the local community, including its historian, say we know nothing about it. Which is, they can show me all sorts of newspaper articles, but of people involved, they don't know anybody. Perhaps we could leave the internees now, August 1940, with Eleanor beavering away in the process of getting most of them released, hopeful that release was going to come. By June 1941, as well as continuing with this, Eleanor had started off on something else. By June 1941, she was aware of the increased danger to the Jews in Europe. She began early on to get details of the slaughter, public knowledge of which doesn't seem to have been available till December 1942. And by 1943, she had set up another committee, the National Committee for the Rescue from Nazi Terror. And for the rest of her life, she was involved in all sorts of plans and schemes, most of which were quite impractical, but trying to get Jews out of Germany and out of Europe. And after the end of the war, she turned direction again and started, to the horror of some of her supporters, mounting campaigns for starving Germans. She died in 1946. I'd like now just to turn to the question, how did her work at Highbury fit the patterns of her professional life? I think it must be seen in the wider context of her fundamental humanitarian beliefs and her commitment to justice and to feminism. She demonstrated that in the reports that she'd written on the difficulties faced by Liverpool dockers and their families, forced to try to earn money within the sort of casual labour system in 1911. In the numerous papers and 2 books that she wrote on family endowment starting in 1924. In her campaign against female genital mutilation in Kenya in 1929, assisted by her friend the Duchess of Atholl. Sadly, this was one campaign that was less successful than she'd hoped. It is, of course, still a custom in some areas in Kenya. In the paper she wrote on behalf of the Children's Minimum Campaign about the scale of needs she wanted adopted by the Unemployment Assistance Board in 1934. In what was seen at the time, and certainly since, as her misguided work with Indian women and her campaigns against child marriage. And given that history, which is by no means exhaustive, her readiness to take up the cudgels on behalf of refugees in Europe and internees in this country was not, I would suggest, unsurprising. She responded, as always, to what she saw as the urgent needs around her. But why? What drove her? Eleanor was not religious, although she sometimes talked about her Quaker Unitarian background and appeared to suggest that the morality she had inherited from that background helped to inform her work. 2 recent accounts stress different aspects of her motivation in Europe in the 1930s. Susan Cohen, whose recent book on Eleanor's work with refugees, emphasizes Eleanor's admiration for Jewish society and Jewish achievement. And perhaps understandably from her perspective as a Jew, Cohen has been impressed by Eleanor's work for the Jewish community from the interwar period until her death. And she's argued quite strongly that it was her profound information for all things Jewish that prompted her refugee work. But that, I'd argue, is to distort what she did. Certainly Eleanor had been profoundly affected by the plight of the Jews in Europe and did what she could to ameliorate it. She was also in favour of a Jewish state in Palestine, with proper safeguards for the Arab communities already there. And she, on one occasion, described herself as a Gentile Zionist. But her first parliamentary interventions on behalf of the victims of Nazi persecution in 1933 were concerned with socialists and pacifists. And later that year, she pointed to what she saw as the dangerous step taken by the removal of women from German government service, and pointing out that any wrong done to the women of one nation must be felt by the women of all nations. And as well as describing herself as a Gentile Zionist, she used lots of terms to describe herself. She was very pleased to describe herself as a suffragist in the early century, as a feminist in the 1930s when it wasn't a term much used, and as an elderly Victorian the year before she died. And she worked for all manner of people in danger in that critical decade of the 1930s. Czechs, Spaniards, socialists. It just happened that the Jews became the most numerous and their persecution the most horrendous. Susan Peterson, whose biography was published in 2005, has a much broader view of Eleanor's work. She sees the work with internees as part of Eleanor's politics of conscience, her sense of belonging to a common humanity, and her belief in democracy and in justice. She saw what was happening to internees as profoundly unjust. She thought it was unwise, if not stupid. And that sense of mutual obligation, leavened with a degree of pragmatism, informed her feminism and all her social actions. And as Peterson has pointed out, she pops up in all sorts of disguises. In relation to the plight of refugees, she was as likely to appear as part of a delegation by the National Council for Civil Liberties, whose refugee committee she chaired, or the League of Nations Union, or the Abyssinia Association, or any one of 3 or 4 committees on Spain. She had, as Harold Nicholson said of her, an astonishing capacity for dull work. And as Peterson notes, she was immune to flattery and almost indifferent to abuse. She was willing to go to the limits of good manners and make herself a nuisance in pursuit of what she believed to be right. And as an independent MP, she couldn't be accused of harbouring ambitions for high office, something she pointed out herself more than once. And she was fiercely independent with a lowercase I. Her decision to stand as an electoral candidate without party backing allowed her to pursue what she believed to be right with as much vigour as she thought necessary. No party whip could be withdrawn from her, no party could discipline her. While her constituents believed in her, she was free to take up those causes she believed to be just, and that her constituents evidently did believe in her, because she won every election easily. Peterson poses the question, did they know what she was doing? But I think there's no doubt that they did, because there's plenty of stuff in the archive about her talks to various universities. Being non-partisan, she was prepared to work with all sorts of people, not necessarily her political allies, because they changed according to the issue. She differed fundamentally on some issues with those who became her allies in her fight for refugees and internees. But these talks are about legacies. What was Eleanor's? Well, it has to be said she had her faults. Perhaps she was naive about foreign affairs. Her campaign against child marriage in India made her a lot of enemies, particularly in India, because of her failure to inform herself about the work already being done and what was seen as her imperialist convictions. And she came in for very similar criticism in her work on suffrage in India. Those same convictions soured her relationship with Nehru, who'd been imprisoned by the British, of course, for 4 years, and from his prison cell was reluctant to accept her assessment of the good that the British had done for India. She didn't seem to have any idea about the degree of displacement of the indigenous population that would occur in the Jewish homeland that she envisaged in Palestine. And I think it's possible to suggest that she would be deeply saddened by the plight of the Palestinians today. She flirted with eugenics, but then who didn't in the interwar period, when it was the social science orthodoxy? She was, so far as I can tell, never a member of the Eugenics Society, unlike her close friend Eva Hubbard, which is a little surprising, given that the society had been very active in this city since 1907 and in this university, whereas a former member of staff, she must still have had many contacts. That she kept her distance certainly suggests she wasn't entirely convinced by their arguments. But it didn't stop her making a speech in the House of Commons about the decreasing birth rate and what she perceived to be the shrinkage of the white populations compared with the yellow, brown and black. This was in 1935. And she very freely used the language of race. But she was a woman of her time. On the other hand, apart from the range of activities we've already mentioned, she helped to found the School of Social Work in this university, hence her portrait, driven by work that she and people like Elizabeth McAdam, her longtime partner, and Maud Royden had done at the Victoria Settlement in the city. The School of Social Work survived for 100 years until 2005. She was an exemplar of generosity, and admittedly her pockets were very deep, but she didn't hesitate to put her hands into them to support people and causes of which she approved. And to go back to one of my original points, as someone who benefited from child benefit, both as a child and as a parent, I believe that that part of her legacy, that important part of our welfare state, has had an inestimable impact. Had she done nothing else, that alone would have been a wonderful legacy. Surely a transformative legacy, even though the scheme finally adopted failed to meet Eleanor's original ambition that women should receive an independent income through their children. But Eleanor did lots of other things. That was what was so remarkable about her. Perhaps most of all, she was an outstanding feminist politician, an example of what women in politics can achieve.